When March finally arrived, it did not come gently, and in eastern Nebraska that year, the thaw was less a season than a negotiation between ice, mud, and stubborn light, with mornings still sharp enough to sting the lungs and afternoons soft enough to loosen the edges of the floodwater. And Thomas began the next phase before anyone else would have considered the field usable. Walking the levees with a survey rod in one hand and a grease pencil tucked into his coat pocket, marking where the ground would need to release first and where the water had to remain a little longer. Because draining a field, he knew, was not the opposite of flooding it. It was its own discipline, and if he pulled the water too quickly, the surface would crack and seal in all the wrong ways. But if he lowered it in measured stages, inch by inch through the spill gates he had welded from parts scavenged off an old Alice Chalmers cultivator and a broken grain elevator assembly, the soil would settle open without being torn apart. And this was the part no one in town understood, because they imagined he had simply drowned his land in desperation, while in truth he had mapped every contour of those 120 acres over 4 seasons, tracked where snowmelt collected, where fungal blight hit worst, where pigweed and foxtail returned after every pass of the disc. And he had come to believe that the problem was not weakness in the crop, but memory in the soil, a memory of constant disturbance that favored the wrong things over and over again. And now, as the water began to retreat, that memory was being interrupted. The first acres to emerge looked ugly enough to satisfy his critics, a dark skin of wet residue, flattened stalk fragments from the previous year, patches of slick mud that clung to his boots and made every step feel heavier than it was. And when Earl Dunning slowed his pickup along the county road and shouted through the window that no sane man would plant corn in a graveyard, Thomas lifted a hand but did not bother answering, because he had already pushed beyond the stage where approval mattered, and because what Earl saw as rot was, to Thomas, evidence of collapse in exactly the places he wanted it: the disease reservoirs, the shallow weed beds, the hardened surface that had once repelled spring moisture now softening into something darker and finer. And in the days that followed, he started testing again, carrying mason jars of soil back to the shed, breaking them apart by hand on a wood bench beside his ledgers, smelling them, wetting them, checking how they settled in water, how long they held shape between his fingers, how quickly the top layer crusted under sun. And every test pointed in the same direction: less compaction at the surface, fewer visible weed sprouts, a richer organic smell, and a texture that suggested the ground had not been ruined but rested. Still, rest was expensive, and the economics of the county made no room for experiments that could not be explained quickly. Because diesel had climbed again that spring, fertilizer prices were biting harder than they had in years, and most men in the township were already calculating how much nitrogen they could afford before the bank started asking sharper questions, while corn contracts moved just enough to keep hope alive without making anyone comfortable. And Thomas, who had sold 2 older implements the previous fall to finance the levee work and the gate hardware, understood exactly what the town thought of him: that he had gambled machinery, labor, and a full season of credibility on a theory about flooded dirt and migrating birds. And if the planting failed, there would be no graceful explanation, only proof in their eyes that stubbornness and intelligence were not the same thing. But Thomas was not working blindly now, and once the field surface could bear weight, he brought out the one machine he trusted most: an aging John Deere 4620 with faded paint and a habit of starting rough in cold weather, pulling behind it not a plow, not a chisel, not even the light tandem disc many expected him to use, but a modified harrow set almost insultingly shallow, just enough to comb residue without turning the earth. Because he had no intention of waking the buried seed bank he believed the flood had weakened. And as the tines whispered across the emerging acres, barely scratching, leaving most of the soil profile intact, even the few men who stopped to watch from the road could not make sense of what they were seeing, because farming in that county had always been loud when it was serious. Engines straining, steel biting, soil rolling over in thick ribbons, and Thomas's field made almost no sound at all. Then came the birds again, not in winter numbers but in trailing waves, picking through the receding margins, pecking at what the water had exposed, and Thomas noticed how few aggressive weeds were following the retreating line compared to prior years, how the shallow puddle zones dried into dark, crumbly sections instead of pale, sealed crust, how earthworm casts appeared in places that had gone nearly lifeless by the end of the last decade, and for the first time he allowed himself to write a sentence in the notebook without crossing it out later, that the field was not recovering from the flood, it was recovering because of it. April came in with a wind that never seemed to settle, carrying the smell of thawed earth and distant rain across the county. And for most farmers it marked the beginning of a familiar urgency. Seed orders finalized, planters calibrated, diesel tanks filled. Every decision compressed into narrow windows that could not be missed. But on Thomas's 120 acres, the rhythm remained deliberately restrained, almost out of step with the rest of the township, because he was not trying to catch the season, was trying to align with something deeper that did not move on a calendar. And so instead of rushing to plant at the first workable day, he waited, testing soil temperature at multiple depths with a thermometer he had modified to read more precisely in the top 2 inches, noting how the flooded ground warmed more evenly than in previous years, how moisture held without pooling, how the structure resisted crusting even after a hard, dry wind passed through. And these small confirmations began to stack into something more solid than theory. The town, however, saw only delay, and delay in farming was often the difference between surviving and slipping under. So when Thomas had still not planted by the time others were already finishing their first passes, the judgment returned with sharper edges, men leaning on fence posts, saying he had missed his window, that whatever strange idea he had chased through the winter had cost him the one thing that mattered, timing, and even the bank manager, a quiet man who rarely drove out to fields, made a brief visit under the pretense of reviewing equipment valuations, his eyes moving across the land with a practiced neutrality that did not hide the calculation underneath. Because 120 acres left unplanted in spring was not a philosophical problem, it was a financial one. But Thomas had chosen his crop and his moment with the same care he had used to hold the water, and when he finally brought out the planter, a 6-row unit he had rebuilt himself with tighter depth control and narrower variance between rows, set it not to the conventional depth most in the county used for corn, but slightly shallower, trusting the improved surface conditions and the retained moisture to support early germination without forcing the seed too deep into colder layers. And as the planter moved, steady and almost quiet compared to the heavy tillage that usually preceded it, something subtle but critical happened. The soil closed around the seed without clumping, without forming the air pockets or hard caps that had plagued his fields in past seasons, and for the first time in years, planting did not feel like a negotiation with a resistant surface. It felt like placing something into a system that was ready to receive it. Days passed, then a week, and the first shoots began to appear, thin green lines breaking through the dark surface with a uniformity that caught even Thomas off guard, because uniform emergence was not something he had seen on his land for a long time. Not since before the years of aggressive tilling and chemical correction had slowly eroded the soil's natural balance, and now, row after row, the plants rose at nearly the same rate, not competing with thick patches of weeds, not struggling through crusted layers, but lifting cleanly into the light. And when Earl Dunning drove past again, slowing out of habit more than intent, he did not shout this time, he simply watched, longer than before, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed should have happened. By late April, the difference was no longer subtle. While neighboring fields showed the usual variation, patches of strong growth beside thinner sections, early weed pressure creeping in despite pre-emergent treatments, Thomas's acres held a consistency that looked almost unnatural in its calmness, and more than one farmer found a reason to drive by, not to laugh this time, but to measure quietly. with their eyes, how a field that had spent the winter underwater was now ahead, in ways that were difficult to explain without admitting that something fundamental had been overlooked for years. Still, Thomas did not celebrate, because he understood that early success in a season could disappear quickly under the wrong conditions. A late frost, a sudden heat wave, a shift in moisture patterns, and so he continued to watch, to record, to adjust where needed, maintaining the same discipline that had guided him through the flood. Because if there was a lesson forming beneath all of this, it was not that one bold act could fix everything, but that a system, once corrected at its foundation, could begin to carry itself forward with less force and more consistency than anything he had tried before. And somewhere between the quiet rows of emerging corn and the fading memory of a field covered in winter water, the town began, slowly and without saying it aloud, to replace one question with another. Not why Thomas had done what he did, but what else he knew that they didn't. May did not arrive as a single shift, but as a slow accumulation of heat, light, and expectation. The kind of month where small differences in a field either begin to disappear or quietly expand into something that cannot be ignored. And on Thomas's 120 acres, the latter was starting to take shape with a clarity that made even him uneasy, because by the second week the corn had not only maintained its uniform emergence, it had begun to outpace neighboring fields in height and leaf development, each plant drawing from a soil profile that seemed to hold moisture just long enough between rains, while still draining excess without sealing over, and the usual interruptions that farmers had come to accept as inevitable. The scattered patches of stunted growth, the thin rows where compaction choked the roots, the early invasions of pigweed and foxtail, were either reduced or absent entirely, leaving behind a field that did not look miraculous but stable. And in farming, stability over time often mattered more than sudden bursts of growth. Thomas tracked everything, walking the rows at dawn and again before dusk, counting leaf stages, measuring height at marked intervals, digging shallow inspection holes with a narrow spade to examine root spread, noting how the roots were pushing outward as much as downward, branching into soil that crumbled instead of breaking apart in dense slabs. And when he rinsed samples in a bucket of water beside the shed, he saw fewer signs of the fungal damage that had once been common in his fields, fewer discolored sections, fewer weak strands that snapped under slight pressure. And though he did not allow himself to call it proof yet, the pattern aligned too closely with what he had hoped the winter flooding would accomplish. A reset not just at the surface, but within the biological structure of the soil itself. In town, the shift was no longer quiet, because farmers measure success not by stories but by comparisons, and by mid-May it was impossible to drive the county roads without noticing that Thomas Hale's field was holding a lead that should not have existed. Not after a winter of standing water, not after a delayed planting, and the conversations changed tone. Less certain, more probing, men asking each other if they had heard exactly how long he had kept the field flooded, whether he had used any treatments afterward, whether there was something he was not saying. And while some still dismissed it as a lucky season, others began to feel the discomfort of a possibility they had not prepared for, that the rules they had followed for years might not be as fixed as they believed. But May is also a month that tests any early advantage, and the test came sooner than expected, when a dry front moved through the region, stalling rain systems for nearly 2 weeks and pushing daytime temperatures higher than average. The kind of early stress that often exposed weaknesses hidden beneath strong initial growth. And across the township, fields that had looked promising began to show the first signs of strain, leaves curling slightly by midday, topsoil drying into lighter shades that hinted at moisture slipping too far below reach, and Thomas, walking his own rows under the same hard sun, watched carefully for the same signals, knowing that if his system had only improved the surface without building resilience deeper down, the advantage would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. What he saw instead forced him to stop more than once, kneeling to press his hand into the soil between rows, feeling a coolness that should not have remained so close to the surface after days without rain, noticing how the leaves held their structure longer into the afternoon, how the plants did not rush into visible stress as quickly as those beyond his boundary lines, and while the difference was not dramatic enough to declare victory, it was consistent enough to confirm that something fundamental had shifted, that the field was no longer reacting to conditions as it once had, but absorbing them differently, distributing stress across a system that had more capacity than before. Still, Thomas understood that every advantage carries its own kind of risk, because standing out in a season draws attention, and attention brings pressure from neighbors, from markets, from the quiet expectations that success must be explained and repeated. And as the dry spells stretched on and the town's curiosity sharpened into something closer to scrutiny, another question began to form beneath the surface of everything, one that had less to do with soil and more to do with consequence. Because if the method he had used could truly change the outcome of a season this early, then what would happen when conditions turned from testing to unforgiving, and whether the same system that seemed to hold steady now would endure when the season demanded more than balance? June did not ask for permission. It arrived with a violence that erased the quiet gains of May in a matter of hours, and when the first storm line built over the plains, it carried the kind of weight that seasoned farmers recognize without needing a forecast, a dark wall that moved low and fast, dragging wind ahead of it like a warning. And by late afternoon, the sky over Thomas's 120 acres had turned the color of bruised steel, the air thick, the light flattened, and then the rain came not as a steady fall but as a force, sheets of water driven sideways, hammering the soil, filling low spots, pushing against every contour that had been so carefully shaped months earlier. And for a moment, standing at the edge of his field, Thomas saw the risk of his entire system revealed at once, because what he had built to hold water in winter was now being tested by water he did not control. The first hour was noise, wind tearing through the young corn, leaves snapping and bending, the surface turning slick, runoff beginning to form where it always had in the past, and across the township the same pattern unfolded, freshly worked fields losing topsoil in thin brown streams, low areas collecting standing water that would suffocate roots if it lingered too long, and men watched from truck windows or porch edges, counting silently what might be lost before the storm even passed. But on Thomas's land something different began to happen, not immediately, not in a way that anyone could have pointed to in that chaos, but in the way the water moved, slower, less concentrated, spreading instead of cutting, following the shallow paths he had designed during the winter flood, filling them just enough before spilling gently into the next section. If the field itself had learned how to absorb what was being forced onto it. By the second hour, the wind intensified, and with it came the real threat, not just water but the force behind it, the kind that can flatten entire acres in minutes. And Thomas moved along the levee lines again, not to stop the storm, because that was impossible, but to make sure the exits held, that the spill gates he had set months ago were opening under pressure rather than locking, that no single section would take more than it could release, and more than once he had to clear debris, branches, broken stalks from the early rows, anything that could clog the narrow channels and turn flow into pressure, and each time he did, the water responded, shifting, redistributing, refusing to build into the destructive force it had become on neighboring farms. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a silence that was heavier than the noise that came before it, the kind of stillness where damage reveals itself slowly. And the next morning, the township drove out, almost by instinct, to measure what had happened, and the pattern was clear. Fields that had been tilled deeply showed scars, shallow trenches where soil had been carried away, patches where young plants lay pressed flat into mud that would dry hard by noon, sections where water had pooled too long, turning green rows into pale, suffocated strips. And when they reached the road that bordered Thomas Hale's land, they slowed, not out of habit this time, but uncertainty. Because the field did not look untouched, that would have been unbelievable. There were signs of stress, some plants bent, edges roughened by wind, but the structure held. The rows remained defined. The soil had not peeled away in ribbons. The low spots had drained instead of drowning. And most importantly, the plants, though shaken, were still upright in a way that suggested they had not been forced beyond their limit. And Thomas, walking the rows again in the aftermath, did not look relieved. He looked focused, checking root stability, pressing soil around the base of weakened stalks, noting which areas had taken more impact than others, because survival of a storm was not the end of the test. It was the beginning of the next phase, recovery. In town, the conversations shifted again, this time without laughter. Because storms level differences as often as they create them, and yet here was a field that had absorbed what others could not. Not perfectly, not without loss, but with a resilience that forced a new kind of question into the open, not whether Thomas had been reckless, but whether he had prepared for something the rest had not, and whether the winter flood that had once looked like madness had in fact been a form of training, not just for the soil, but for the entire system he had built around it. And as the days after the storm began to warm again, pushing the damaged fields toward whatever recovery they could manage, another tension began to rise quietly beneath everything. Because surviving one storm did not guarantee the season, and if anything, it raised the stakes, because now the difference was visible to everyone, and what had once been dismissed could no longer be ignored. July did not arrive with drama so much as consequence, the kind that settles in after a storm and begins to separate what endured from what merely survived, and across the county the difference became visible not in a single glance but in the slow arithmetic of growth. In the way rows either filled out or thinned, in how color deepened or faded under a sun that now pressed down without interruption, and on Thomas's 120 acres, the plants did not surge forward recklessly. They continued in the same steady pattern that had defined the field since emergence. Leaf by leaf, node by node, building height and density without the sudden stalls that had become common elsewhere. And while neighboring farms struggled to correct the damage left by the June storm, applying additional nitrogen where runoff had stripped it away, earworking sections that had crusted into hard plates, fighting late waves of weeds that had taken advantage of disturbed soil, Thomas found himself doing less, not because there was nothing to do, but because the system he had set in motion demanded fewer corrections. He still walked the rows more now than before, because attention was the one input he refused to reduce, carrying a small knife to split stalk bases and check internal health, watching for early signs of disease that often followed storm stress. But again the pattern held: fewer lesions, stronger tissue, roots that anchored deep enough to resist the midsummer winds that swept through in short, hot bursts, and each observation added weight to a conclusion he had been careful to avoid naming: that the flood had not simply removed problems, had altered the balance that created them, shifting the field away from constant intervention toward something closer to self-regulation. The town did not ignore it anymore. Ignoring requires distance, and by July there was none left, because numbers began to circulate, informal at first, estimates of plant height, ear formation, comparisons made by men who had spent decades reading fields with a glance, and the consensus, though rarely spoken directly to Thomas, was forming all the same. His field was not just doing well, it was leading, and not by a narrow margin that could be dismissed as variation, but by a consistency that suggested a different baseline entirely. Curiosity crossed the boundary into action the day Earl Dunning stopped his truck at the edge of the field and did not leave immediately, instead stepping out, boots pressing into the soil as he walked a few rows in, bending to pick up a handful of dirt, rubbing it between his fingers the same way Thomas had done for years. And for a long moment he said nothing, just looked across the uniform lines stretching toward the far levee before finally asking, without mockery, without the edge that had once defined his voice, how long the water had stayed on the field, and Thomas answered simply, giving the number of days. The depth ranges, the timing of the drawdown, not as a defense, not as a lesson, just as fact. And Earl nodded once, if fitting that information into something larger he had not yet fully understood. That moment did not change the town overnight, but it shifted the direction of its attention because others followed, some openly, some under the cover of casual visits, asking questions that grew more specific each time about the levee spacing, the gate sizes, the sequence of flooding and release, about whether the birds had been planned or simply accepted. And Thomas answered what he could, though he left out the years of observation that had made the decisions possible, because those could not be transferred in a conversation. And perhaps because part of him knew that copying the action without understanding the system would not produce the same result. By mid-July, the ears had begun to set, and this was where the season often revealed its true direction, because uniform growth meant little if pollination failed or if stress interrupted kernel formation, and once again the field held its pattern, silks emerging in tight windows, tassels shedding in coordination that reduced the gaps that plagued less consistent stands. And when the first informal yield estimates were made, walking rows and counting, projecting numbers that farmers rarely share until they are certain, the figures attached to Thomas's acres were enough to quiet even the most stubborn voices, because they did not suggest a good year. They suggested an exceptional one. Yet even as the numbers rose, Thomas did not expand, did not rush to plan the next season or double his approach, because he had seen too many cycles where success invited overreach, and overreach returned the system to the same instability he had spent years trying to escape. And instead he wrote, more than ever, filling pages with what had worked, what had almost failed, what conditions had mattered most, because the lesson forming was not about a single flood or a single season. It was about restraint, about knowing when to act and when to allow a system to carry itself forward. And somewhere in that quiet accumulation of evidence, the town completed a transition it had not chosen consciously, from dismissal to doubt to observation and finally to respect. Not loud, not public, but present in the way trucks slowed, not to laugh, but to look. In the way questions were asked without edge, and in the way a field that had once been called ruined became, without announcement, the one everyone measured themselves against. August carried the weight of decision in a quieter way, the kind that settles over a field as it moves from promise into outcome, and for Thomas the days narrowed into a steady rhythm of observation and restraint, because this was the stage where too much interference could undo what months of careful alignment had built, and so he limited his actions to what was necessary, monitoring moisture, watching for late-season pests, checking kernel development with the same deliberate attention he had given every phase before, and across his 120 acres the corn held its line, ears filling evenly, rows maintaining their structure, and the variability that often forced difficult harvest choices simply did not appear. By early September, the color began to shift, green fading into the deeper tones that signaled maturity, and the town, which had followed Thomas's season with a mix of skepticism and reluctant interest, now watched with a different kind of focus, because harvest is where stories end or collapse, where every claim is reduced to numbers that cannot be argued with. And when Thomas finally brought out the combine, an older but well-maintained machine he had tuned himself over years, the first pass cut through rows that stood firm and dry, the grain flowing clean into the hopper with a consistency that required few adjustments, and even he, who had prepared for success, felt the weight of it when the initial yield checks came in higher than anything he had recorded on that land before. The numbers did not stay private for long. They never do in a farming community, and as more acres were cut and more loads weighed, the estimates solidified into something undeniable, a yield that outpaced neighboring farms not by a small margin that could be explained away, but by a level that forced comparison, forced questions, forced the quiet admission that what had happened on Thomas Hale's land was not luck, not a one-season anomaly, but the result of a system that had altered the baseline itself. Earl Dunning returned again, this time not to ask a question but to watch the combine move, standing at the edge of the field as the machine traced steady lines through the crop. And when Thomas shut it down for a moment to check a setting, Earl spoke without looking at him, saying that he had farmed his land the same way for 30 years and had never seen anything like this come out of a field that had spent a winter underwater. And Thomas did not answer immediately, because there was no simple reply that would carry the weight of what had led here. And when he finally did, it was not an explanation, but a reflection, that the land had not been forced into producing more. It had been allowed to stop producing the problems that had held it back. By the time the last acres were harvested and the final totals recorded, the impact extended beyond Thomas's own accounts, because higher yields meant better contracts, stronger leverage in a market that rarely favored small operators. And the financial pressure that had hung over his decisions months earlier shifted into something else. Not comfort, because farming rarely allows that, but stability, a margin that could absorb risk without collapsing under it. And in town, the conversations changed for the last time that season. Not about whether Thomas had been reckless, not even about how exactly he had done it, but about what parts of it could be understood, tested, adapted, because what had once been dismissed as madness had now become a reference point. Yet Thomas did not expand, did not buy more land or invest in larger equipment the way others expected after a year like this. Instead, he walked the empty field after harvest, the soil once again exposed, but different now, darker, more open, carrying the memory of water, not as damage but as structure. And he knew that repeating the result would require the same discipline, the same willingness to act against instinct when the system demanded it, because the lesson of the season was not that flooding a field created success, but that understanding when and why to do it could change everything. And as winter approached again, quieter this time, without the edge of doubt that had surrounded the previous year, a question lingered not just for Thomas, but for the entire town, because they had seen what the land could become under a different set of rules, and whether they would follow those rules or continue with their own would define more than just the next season. October settled in without spectacle, the fields across the county stripped down to their base again, lines erased, color drained, everything reduced to soil and memory. And for Thomas, that reduction was where the real work returned, not the visible kind that drew attention, but the quiet accounting of what had been learned and what could be trusted, because a single season, no matter how strong, could not be allowed to become a belief without being tested again. And so he moved through the empty 120 acres with the same notebook he had carried for years, marking where the flood had performed as expected, where the drainage had nearly failed, where the storm had pressed harder than the system had absorbed, building not a story but a map of decisions that could be repeated or refined. In town, the story had already begun to change shape, told in shorter versions that lost the detail but kept the shock. The farmer who flooded his land and outperformed everyone, the winter that looked like destruction and ended in record yields. And while those versions carried far, they missed the part that mattered most, the years before the flood, the mornings spent measuring soil that no one else thought to measure, the seasons of small losses that built the understanding required to take a risk that looked from the outside like madness. And Thomas did not correct those stories, because he knew that what people wanted was the event, not the process, and without the process, the event could not be repeated. A few farmers tried anyway that autumn, walking their own fields with new attention, considering where water might be held, where it might be released, some even beginning small levee lines along low sections, testing in ways that felt safer, controlled, and Thomas watched without interference, because systems are not taught by instruction alone. They are learned through consequence, and each field would respond differently depending on what had been done to it over years, and whether its structure could support the same kind of reset he had forced onto his own. By November, the cold began to return, not sharply at first, but enough to signal that the window for action was closing again, and Thomas stood once more at the edge of his land, the same place where the previous year had begun with doubt pressing in from every direction. And this time the decision did not feel bold. It felt necessary, because what he had seen was not an accident. It was a pattern, one that required repetition not for proof, but for stability, and so he opened the gates again, allowing water to move slowly back across the acres, not as a gamble now, but as a continuation, a system that had shown it could carry itself forward if given the same conditions that had allowed it to reset in the first place. The town did not laugh this time, not loudly, not even quietly, because once something has been proven in numbers, in yield, in resilience against storm and stress, it no longer belongs to belief, it belongs to reality. And while not everyone followed, not everyone was ready to step outside the methods that had defined their work for decades. The presence of that flooded field in winter carried a different meaning, not as a sign of failure, but as a question, one that sat with each farmer as they looked across their own land, asking whether what they had always done was still the best way forward. And for Thomas, walking back from the levee as the first thin sheet of winter water began to settle once more over the soil, the lesson had already simplified itself into something that did not need to be written down again, that the land did not resist change. It resisted force, and when force was removed, when the system was allowed to reset, instead of being corrected again and again at the surface, it moved toward balance on its own, not perfectly, not without risk, but with a consistency that no amount of intervention had ever achieved.